But first, one of the most controversial and shocking books to be published for many years, American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, was published in America 2 weeks ago. But months before its publication, it had caused heated debate over its graphic depiction of sex and violence. It's been called a how-to novel on the torture and dismemberment of women. As a result, the original publishers dropped the book at the last minute. It's now been published by Random House's Vintage Books in America and next month by Picador in Britain. Its Brat Pack author, Bret Easton Ellis, was in the bestseller lists at the age of 21 with his first novel, Less Than Zero, a nihilistic depiction of the lives of the rich and young in Los Angeles. His second novel, Rules of Attraction, was a critical and commercial failure. But with American Psycho, Ellis is back in the headlines. The book is a nightmarish vision of New York life in the 80s, seen through the eyes of serial killer Patrick Bateman, a yuppie with a predilection for torture and murder. There are 10 graphically detailed descriptions of attacks, particularly on women, in which he decapitates, crucifies, rapes and mutilates his victims. This is the start of one such passage. It may upset you.
Perhaps on instinct, perhaps from memory, she makes a futile dash for the front door, crying out. Though the Chardonnay has dulled her reflexes, the Scotch I've drunk has sharpened mine, and effortlessly I'm leaping in front of her, blocking her escape, knocking her unconscious with 4 blows to the head from the nail gun. I drag her back into the living room, laying her across the floor over a white Vallecutro cotton sheet, and then I stretch her arms out, placing her hands flat on thick wooden boards, palms up, and nail 3 fingers on each hand at random to the wood by their tips.
It's writing like this that has caused such offence. Some have called for the book to be banned. The Late Show's guests have already read the book and I'll be talking to them in a few moments. But first, the story behind the American publication. Over the last few months, the American literary world has been convulsed by the uproar surrounding American Psycho.
On a personal level, I was just horrified by the descriptions of violence that were contained in the book. And then on another level, as a feminist and as someone who works full-time for women's empowerment and women's rights, I was very frightened by it because I think it sends a very dangerous message to people who read it.
Does it reflect violence against women? Yes. Is violence against women ubiquitous in our culture? Absolutely. And that's what fiction is supposed to do, reflect the culture.
To have books like this published just reinforces how women are viewed by this society, which is subhuman. And that is actually taken out on women's bodies in real life. And I certainly think that women's lives are more important than what we tend to think of as the right of males to say what they want about them.
The highly respected publisher Simon & Schuster had intended to publish American Psycho this January.
Martin Davis, who's CEO of Paramount Communications, Inc., which owns Simon & Schuster, who was the original publisher of this book, had got hold of a December issue of Spy magazine because there was a piece about Paramount in that edition of the issue of the magazine. And adjacent to the piece on Paramount was a 1-page piece on American Psycho by Bret Ellis, which included an excerpt from the book, which was literally a paragraph, maybe 70 words. And that Martin Davis read this and picked up the phone and called Dick Snyder, who runs Simon & Schuster, and said, "What is this book you're publishing, American Psycho?"
The official reason for Simon & Schuster's withdrawal was, quote, a matter of taste. However, 48 hours after they pulled out, Random House bought the rights.
I thought it was a very ugly book at times. I thought it was a very ugly book. I was surprised at, in some ways, how much uglier some of the ugly bits were than I anticipated, and also really how much more purpose it appeared to have than I'd been led to believe that it would have.
Mehta and Ellis defended American Psycho as an indictment of what they saw as the destructive materialism of the 1980s.
The narrator of the novel, in many ways, is is the crystallization of, I guess, everything I found upsetting or terrible about the decade. People only paid attention to appearances. They only paid attention to, how much money one made, what one looked like, if one was in good shape, if one was wearing nice clothes, if one had the right table at the right restaurant. And this seemed to hold true for a disproportionate amount of people that maybe in other decades it wasn't. I guess mostly because of how much money people were making during this time.
Evelyn and I are by far the best-dressed couple. I'm wearing a lamb's wool topcoat, a wool jacket with wool flannel trousers, a cotton shirt, a cashmere V-neck sweater, and a silk tie, all from Armani. Evelyn's wearing a cotton blouse by Dolce & Gabbana, suede shoes by Yves Saint Laurent, a stenciled calf skirt by Adrian Landau, with a suede belt by Jill Stewart. Carruthers is wearing a sport coat, a cashmere vicuna cardigan sweater, cavalry twill trousers, a cotton shirt, and a silk tie, all from Hermes. How tacky, Evelyn whispered to me. I silently agreed.
What if you took a character or a person who is all surface flash and put him in this society? What could he get away with?
Reading it is a peculiar experience. I mean, it gives you the creeps. It's a horrific book, and it's deeply upsetting. But there's a reason why it's deeply upsetting. There's a reason why he uses the kind of violence he uses. It's interesting. Before, I think he focused quite clearly on the banality of our lives. In this book, he focuses on the banality of evil. Not in the traditional sense of that term, but in the sense that the banality of our lives has made evil so possible, because everything is essentially meaningless in the world in which this man is operating. I mean, the only thing that's important is restaurant meals and the right clothes, and it reduces all human beings to the commodity level. And that's what this book is really trying to explore. Sometimes unsuccessfully, sometimes I think successfully, always gruesomely and violently.
There's a kind of arrested development about this book and an infantilism, and it's almost as if the author kept saying to himself, how much feces can I smear on the wall before Mommy and Daddy really get angry? And Mommy and Daddy got angry.
R.Z. Shepard's review in Time magazine rated American Psycho's value as even less than 0.
Every critic of this generation is in jeopardy of being called an old fogey by the next. But one thing doesn't change, and that is a writer has to do something with the material. And I'm afraid what Mr. Ellis did was to write disgustingly about the disgusting, and superficially about the superficial.
The problem that we have with it is that by being published by a major publishing house with a very good reputation, what they're saying basically is that we find this worthy of our name being on it. And whether that's because they find literary merit in it, they believe that the torture and dismemberment of women is acceptable as entertainment, or they're simply going on the financial bottom line. They think they're going to make a lot of money off, again, the torture and dismemberment of women. Either way, it's unacceptable. It's not right. And that's when you have to step up and say, we find this irresponsible.
Through Vintage and through my publishing in England, I was sympathetic to new writing, and particularly writing which was viewed to be on the edge. And at that stage, obviously, the controversy was beginning to build, though I don't believe anybody had any idea, I certainly didn't, that it was going to develop to quite the pitch that it has, that type of moral panic that the book appears to have caused.
It is ironic that people are reading this book and just taking it on a purely surface level, who are just complaining about the violence or the combination of violence and sex that's in the book and not finding any meaning in any of that. And I mean that's their choice, I suppose. I mean, they can or they can't. But I think it's implicitly there. I mean, I think it's very strongly there.
But many American women do not see American Psycho Ellis's way. One group has started a boycott of both Random House and the book. Some want it banned altogether.
This business of free speech is hogwash. I mean, there are certain things that are not allowed to be said in public. I can't stand out there and advocate the overthrow of my government without having some repercussions come my way. There are certain things that are not acceptable.
I am a feminist. I've always been publicly identified as a feminist. It's one of the most important parts of my life. The other most important part is freedom of speech. I mean, any liberation movement ought to have as one of its basic tenets the greatest range of freedom of speech. And if being feminist meant suppressing something like this, suppressing something because we don't like what it tells us about how, in fact, women may be viewed by some men, I think we've taken an unfortunate turn in the road.
With me to discuss the book are Helen McNeil, lecturer in American Literature and Film at the University of East Anglia; Bel Mooney, author of The 4th of July, a novel about the soft porn business; Yvonne Roberts from The Observer; and Iain Banks, author of The Wasp Factory. We invited the British publishers Picador to take part tonight, but they declined, saying that it wasn't publishing practice to promote books before they're published. Well, everyone here has read the book. First of all, your reaction, Bel Mooney.
Well, I've read quite a lot of pornography in my time, which I don't like to confess, but I have for research purposes. And I'm not easily shocked. I found this book stomach-churning. It made me very angry. And I'm glad I read it because it was finally crystallized for me, the central question, which seems to be whether the author's right to say whatever he or her likes ultimately goes beyond the question of freedom of expression, which was raised on the film, and becomes a question of debasement. I think this novel debases.
Do you think this novel debases, Yvonne Roberts?
Absolutely the opposite. I think the first third is appallingly tedious, and if anybody gets past that, good luck to them. I think the last 2/3 are actually very impressive. It surprised me. I would not have come to this book willingly, but having read it and having taken deep breaths while doing so, I think it says something very valid. And I think one of the problems is that the whole focus has been on what it does to women. Actually, it isn't just about what it does to women. I think the man has made a case very, very strongly for what consumerism does to all of us. It dehumanizes. And he doesn't just kill women, he kills animals, he kills tramps, he kills best friends. And he does it in a way which points up what he says. It's all surface, surface, surface. And I think one of the recurring themes of a chat show hostess, constantly bringing in this idea of intimacy while all of this mayhem is going on, is a very, very clear idea of where we're all going. I think 20 years from now, I could read that book with a woman as the heroine, or the villain, whichever way you want to see it.
Helen McNeil, do you think that's the case?
I found the book a failure. I thought that the characterizations were flat and simply serving to be vehicles for Ellis's negative obsessions. I thought the writing was slack and repetitious. Superficiality in a short journalistic piece is one thing. Over 400 pages, it becomes very hard to continue. The plot is predictable. There's very little tension. There's no climax. I think with the title American Psycho, it's presented to us as if it were simply an inflated version of a film synopsis. There's this yuppie, and it turns out he's a serial murderer, and this is symbolic of Reagan's America. We're given that as kind of way to read it. But in fact, as everyone has been saying, the experience of reading it is actually quite different and much uglier, and the scenes of sadistic torture are so extensive and so repetitious that to me became what the book was about.
And to the exclusion of all else?
It didn't actually seem to me to be functioning on a symbolic level because it spent so much time talking about what it purported to criticize. So it served, as pornography does, to desensitize you to cruelty. And in this sense, Picador bear a very serious responsibility for publishing it.
We must come on to that later, but Iain Banks, you have dealt with torture and murder in your book, particularly The Wasp Factory, for which you, of course, received quite a lot of attention. How did it strike you?
I actually have to admit, I found bits of it quite funny as well. I mean, I still found bits of it repellent and fairly stomach-churning.
What, you found that some of the violent bits funny?
No, I didn't. I found bits I think were meant to be funny, which are the bits of these interaction between these various Manhattan yuppies, and in fact, even the bit where he goes out to deliberately actually strangle one of his best friends, who's also having a relationship with this woman, and it turns out that the guy's actually bisexual and thinks when he puts his hands to his neck that he then starts stroking him and he can't actually kill him. I found that a bit hilarious. But yes, at the same time, obviously what we're actually here to talk about is the reaction to the book, in a sense, rather than just the book, which I have to say I think was too long. And I think it opens and closes brilliantly. I think that there's two brilliant little phrases, just things that are used right at the very beginning and the very end that work perfectly and encapsulate it. And I agree that the Psycho, in a sense, epitomises, or can be seen to epitomise, a totally sort of surface-based yuppie lifestyle.
But to stick with the violence, I mean, your depiction of violence goes some way, but at no time has it ever gone this far. Do you think that you could write, or do you think it's acceptable to write this kind of violence?
You see, acceptable is, it's a word that everyone has their own sort of definition of. Acceptable, I wouldn't actually want to write that with a better excuse than Bret Easton Ellis actually has. But I wouldn't actually, put it this way, I would never agree with banning the book, but I can understand people wanting to boycott it.
Well, Yvonne,
there's an argument for that. I'm not
do you think the violence
right.
is justified?
I do. I think censorship doesn't achieve anything. I mean, really, I think who is to judge whether anybody's going to read this book? It's Bel going to decide who's going to read the book. I mean, I think censorship doesn't achieve anything. I think people, the first thing they do is choose to read it. When they decide to read it, how they react to it individually will depend on how well they've read the book.
But censorship apart, do you think the actual detail of the violence is justified?
I do.
Does it add to your understanding of what he's trying to depict?
I think two things. One, I think it's rather like the picture of the incinerated soldier in the Iraqi war that the Observer published, which caused enormous furore because it was the first real symbol of what war means. Likewise with the depiction of violence, it is so appalling that I think, as Norman Mailer pointed out in a piece in Vanity Fair, it actually deters those who might even begin to think this might be a pleasant way to spend a Sunday evening.
Do you think that's a valid argument?
Well, no, I think a mendacious fog has been cast by liberals over this whole issue of censorship, and I think that as we go into the next decade, we have to rethink that. There has always been censorship. The question is not of whether there is or is not censorship, but of what kind, what degree, and who, as it were, directs it. In the case of this book, I would have liked to have seen, if you like, two forms of censorship. One, self-censorship on the part of the author. You can achieve what he was trying to achieve without doing what he's done. You could quote a book like Last Exit to Brooklyn, which is trying to show a society which is loveless, which is debased, without going, even the worst scene in that does not approach what he has done.
But so you're saying that to depict this kind of society is valid if it's done well?
Yes, if it's done well, but he hasn't done it well. The first thing, and I think, he could have exercised some self-censorship, but the detail, I mean, there is incredible detail. We could not show it on this television scene, as you know, not even this late or even at 3 o'clock in the morning. First point. The second point is that censorship, in quotes, that I would like to have seen would be on the part of the publisher, because we do not know whether there is any causal link between pornography and violence. It seems to me that the burden should now be reversed, the burden of proof, and that for any teenage boy who could not get this material on video to be able to wander into Waterstones, pick it up and read it, and sort of reveal to himself the darkest side of his own imaginings, dressed up as literary fiction, tricked out with the respectability of a trade format book, is a disgrace to Picador, and I think they should not have published.
Is that a worry to some, well, just before I come to you, is that a worry to you, Iain, about this whole idea that somebody can come in and pick books like this up, a young person, and be...
No, because in the end, video is much, much more immediate. In the end, words are just words. I mean, I hate to say it's only a story,
but
images are more. Well, yes, I'm an author. I'm sort of doing my own business down there. I know, but in the end, nevertheless, especially I think for the period of possible young person, or whatever, images are infinitely more
Helen McNeil, I mean, this is
important.
This is part of a wider literary tradition. I mean, Burroughs, for example.
I'm a little bit afraid that we're sounding like characters from Dickens, worrying about what a putative young person might think reading this. What a person. Yes. I don't think that there are fixed barriers as to what's okay and what's not okay. One breast okay, two breasts pornography. But I do think that a book like this raises issues of what you need to do in order to make a critique. I think that this book does not establish an ironic or comic critical difference or distance from what it's talking about for enough of the book, so that it functions as a means of drawing us into the sadism rather than saying, oh, well, this sadism is typical or symbolic.
That's precisely its value. I mean, it seemed to me what I found very powerful was almost all of the scenes of extreme violence involving women begin with a sexual setup, which I find a turn on. I mean, however reluctant I am about this, however unwilling I am to read this book, I start to find these descriptions a turn on.
Well, you see, it's functioning as desensitizing pornography
No, that
for you.
isn't desensitizing at all. It's actually doing quite the opposite. I find it erotic.
But are you saying that there's something to do with what you feel about sex and violence
well,
intertwined?
then it suddenly slides into violence, and you think, hang on a minute, is this a natural conclusion to what I'm feeling at the beginning? And I start to question, which I think is absolutely validating this book. I start to question, where do these things begin and end? I think we live in a very nasty society. I think partly this book is copying it because there are a whole series of things happening. There are videos which are extremely nasty. There are a whole series of feature films coming out. Like
the guy in the book is hooked on videos. This is a very important part.
Right.
He's always returning videos. It's a motif.
Somehow, liberal societies, as Bel was referring to, has found this the easy target. I mean, I think it's far more valid to question the society we're living in that produces all this than to have a go at some poor little book that actually will sink without trace.
Do you think he has got a moral context for it? Is that not the problem?
This book is a major publishing hype. This is not a poor little book.
He is making a
also, there didn't have to be a hype as well. You know, in a sense, we are now part of the hype, whether we like it or not. It's now going to sell by
But Helen, carry on with your point.
Well, this is not a poor little book. It's part of a major publishing hype. And when you're saying that scenes of sadistic torture, and I think we must be clear that we can't even reproduce the language of this on this program because it's so violent and so extensive. If these are preceded by more conventional porn erotic scenes, threesomes and so on, what we are having done to us is we're being softened up by this. Then it slides over into the sadistic.
But I want to ask Bel, do you think then that the rules of fiction are changing?
Well, I think they have changed, but they may have to change back. I think we may be moving into the next era, and because writers always have to question what they do. Well, when Yeats wrote in a poem, "Did those words of mine send out 16 men the English shot?" Writers, despite what you say about the power of images, as we all know, words have enormous power and always have had. It's the duty of writers always to question what they do, as well as to listen to those. And Bret Easton Ellis didn't listen to his editors who tried to make him change this book. And always to be questioning what we're doing. Now, I think Yvonne was enormously honest to say what she just said about being turned on. When I wrote in the 4th of July, there was one scene which was a rape scene. It was quite graphic. It was rather horrible. It really bothered me to write it. And somebody said to me afterwards, "Aren't you worried that would turn people on?" After which I really lost sleep. I now think I was wrong to write that scene, and if I was to write that book again, I would remove it.
You're right too, because when I found the erotic parts a turn on, as soon as it became violent, it was horrible. You know, as simple as that. And no one's going to be sort of seduced into really relating violence as a natural adjunct of sex.
You don't think? Because we've only a minute to latch on to this point. But what about this argument that it is a how-to novel?
Oh, that's just silly. For a start, the whole thing about trying to put a nail gun through people's fingers, it wouldn't work. Palms,
but how to what? How to kill a clown? He has something from the Talking Heads at the beginning, which I'm now going to misquote, but it's something like, things were falling apart and nobody took any notice. People are now. These kind of discussions mean that people are now. We are looking at the society we live in.
And that validates it. Do you think there'll be more of this, but written, would it, if it was written better, would you have a different attitude?
I think it needs to come from a different direction. That is, I think we're going to look back at the 80s as having been a great era for satire. There's nothing like greed and viciousness to bring out the satiric writer. I think we've had Martin Amos's Money, we've had Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, we've had Kathy Acker's, what's it called, Sex and Death in High School or something. We've had Tama Janowitz's Slaves of New York. These are all, very powerful and interesting books which deal with the nexus of greed, sex, and power. I think the book in question is nowhere near the quality of any of these.
Which brings us to the next point, and coming back to the point we talked about earlier, which was, should Picador publish? I mean, do you think that they're justified in publishing?
No, I don't. I think that they're doing it for money, but this is what it's all about. Bret Easton Ellis has made a killing. Anybody who publishes this will make... I'm sorry, that was a very bad point. Literally, anybody who publishes will make a killing. If I was on the Picador list as a respectable novelist, frankly, I would be ashamed to be on the same list as this book. I don't care if it makes me sound snooty. I feel snooty about it. I think the book is shit.
What about that? What about the idea that Picador, they've got, well, Iain McEwan, Primo Levi,
publishing is about making money. I mean, there's a sort of intellectual snobbery about what... The majority of people who buy this will buy it for the good bits. They'll buy it for the good bits, I suspect. I hope that when they start reading the good bits, they'll start questioning themselves and they'll start questioning what this book is about, and I think then it works. I don't really care whether it's well written or badly written. I care about the effect it has on the reader, and I think the effect it has on the reader, as Norman Mailer says, will actually be to the benefit of society, I hope.
What about the idea, Helen, that there is a moral responsibility on the part of the publisher?
Well, I do think publishers are in business, you know, like anybody else. They're manufacturers, you know, booksellers are shopkeepers, so we mustn't indulge ourselves in that direction. I do think that it was erroneous to publish this particular book, and that we are in effect hyping it no matter what we say about it, which is why I keep reiterating that I think it fails aesthetically as a novel. It's very hard to read through. I mean, were I not on this program, I would not have got through to the end. But I think also we do need to consider the way in which pornography is being redefined right at the moment while we're here. That is, I think Mary Whitehouse has been God's gift to the pornography industry, because she's everybody's repressive grandmother. So anything she's against, well, it must be rather interesting. And as a result, I think pornography has continued to have a good name as something exciting and a turn on, when what it is really seen as now is that which degrades, that which dehumanizes, that which exploits and desensitizes to suffering, and this book participates in that activity.
And you know what I think it's, sorry, just, you know, the word, the debasement, I said at the beginning. What its real crime, Ellis's real crime, is not to debase women, not to debase people, not to debase little animals on the street, but to debase the imagination. That's what I can't forgive him for.
Iain Banks, if it wasn't Bret Easton Ellis's name on that, would it have been published?
Difficult one. It would depend, I think. I think it'd probably been edited more comprehensively had it not been his name, or somebody with the same sort of clout, I think. But in the end, I think Picador are right, and I think it's quite a brave decision, but a right decision for them to publish it.
Thank you all very much indeed.